Tak dobrý večer naposledy dneska. Tak po celém dni, co jsme říkali, jaký problém dezinformace jsou, tak teďka si konečně řekneme, co se s tím dá dělat, jak ten problém vyřešíme. A přejdu zase do angličtiny, protože máme zahraniční hosty. So my first speaker, you saw her on the last panel, my ex-colleague from Brussels, Finnish expert residing in Sweden, as you can see on the screen, Anneli Ahonen. And then we have from University of Lund and co-author of the papers that designed the response of the UK government and the Swedish government, James Pamment. Thank you very much for coming. It's great to have you here. The whole day we were discussing about the problems and the weaknesses. Now we want to discuss the solutions. And quite often we are focused on what are we missing? So I thought we would start a bit differently. Could you name me your 3 most favorite initiatives in the civil society that are countering disinformation? What are they doing? What is their success? And how they could help the civil society community in Europe to actually do their job better. Anneli, why don't you start?
Thanks, Jakub. Well, three best ones. It's difficult, right? There are so many. I think I would start with those initiatives who sort of don't focus only on disinformation, but investigate the money flows, the crimes, and the bigger dirty schemes behind the actors that are also spreading disinformation. So these would be journalistic and open source intelligence initiatives like Bellingcat, like The Insider in Russia, now forced to be fled from there. This would be journalistic network organizations like OCCRP, Quota Story. This would be worth following from this type of angle, where you can not only see debunked messages, but also that really bring new information about the actors that are spreading disinformation. And then, as I am now given the opportunity to name these initiatives, I would, of course, also name our former workplace, EU versus Disinfo. Or should I now stay strictly on the NGO side?
I thought we should first discuss the civil society and then move on to the government later.
Okay, let's leave that for later. Yeah. Well, then I would like to also name the Czech think tank, European Values. I think that's been there for so long. It has started and initiated many of the things that many other think tanks in other countries nowadays are doing, and sort of is always ahead of the trends. And I think it has been an extremely important voice in this area. And then maybe the Ukrainian Stop Fake, which is also a very old initiative that has been there from the beginning and has got the thing right from earlier on, both exposing, analyzing, debunking, investigating, bringing new information about Russian propaganda.
Sounds
so that
great.
Would be it from my side.
Thank you very much. James, exactly the same question.
Great, thank you. Well, it's such a pleasure to be here. I'm going to be a bit more diplomatic. Maybe I won't list my favorite NGOs, but I'll name 3 areas where NGOs are really good and then pick out a couple of examples. And one thing that NGOs are really good at is just having that laser focus on a single issue. So, NGOs are great if they're interested in the climate, if they're interested in human rights. They have that single issue focused, and that's a tremendous strength as an NGO. So there are so many who have a single focus related to disinformation, whether they're focused on a country or whether they're focused on kind of strengthening media literacy in that country, or if they're trying to understand China or Russia better. One I really like that I've been working with recently is Reset. They look at the tech platforms, and their single issue is to hold the tech platforms to account for what they're not doing about disinformation that spreads on them. So that's sort of an example of a single issue. I think all of the NGOs, one thing that they're really great for is engaging young people. Like, they hire so many young people, like new graduates. They train them in kind of online investigation. They teach them open source intelligence. They teach them, the basics of policy. And I think it's fantastic because, they get the energy of these young people. They get their kind of social media know-how, but they also then train them in a discipline. And these people who go through this process, whichever NGO they're working for, they're going to go out and work in so many different areas over the next 40, 50 years of their careers, or 40 years. And they're going to bring what they've learned and this know-how and this analysis side of things to whatever job they end up doing, wherever they end up. And I think that's something that NGOs are fantastic for. And then lastly, NGOs have a different kind of legitimacy. Civil society has a different kind of legitimacy to governments. And so there are some things that only civil society can do. You really trust Amnesty on human rights, for example, so they have that legitimacy. Now, if you want to train journalists in how to not become victims of disinformation, not spread it, which, they had been doing and has been a problem, it's very difficult for governments to do that because then it almost feels like censorship of journalists. But there are organizations like First Draft, for example, which has just actually shut down and has become part of Brown University, I think, in the US. But they can speak to those journalists and they can be legitimate. They have their single issue. It's the only thing they care about. So they can offer that. And I think that's something that, again, only civil society can do.
Sounds great. Although I do believe that some of our friends from Lithuania or even from here from Czech Republic would be sorry that the ELFS movement wasn't mentioned. So for those of you who are not familiar with these guys, these are ELFs who are fighting the trolls on social media, trying to counter the deluge of disinformation. They are also monitoring the chain emails, which is probably something we would be slightly nervous if the government was doing, watching private messaging. And this is, I think, very important that it's the civil society stepping in and doing something that the governments can't be doing. But as far as I know, there are no ELFs in Sweden or Finland, are they? Or in the UK. And yeah, so let's move to the other segment. Apart from civil society, we also have the governments doing something. And yes, there are a lot of gaps and we will be addressing them, but what are the best practices of the governments when it comes to countering disinformation? What, for example, other countries could copy for their citizens?
Well, here I could continue with the Lithuanian ELFs and then point out the Lithuania's approach. In the previous panel, there was also Nerijus from Lithuania, who could probably explain this better than I can. But I think there is a lot what Lithuanian government is doing that could be copied in other countries. They have very operational way of monitoring, analyzing the information space all through the country, and have very rapid way of reacting to any narratives or messages, disinformation campaigns that are considered risks or potential threats that sort of go beyond the line of that there has to be some kind of reaction, and the cooperation of flagging these disinformation campaigns to media, and the other way around, media flagging them to the government, is working very well, as well as the ELFs. I think that could be seen as part of the whole approach in Lithuania. And then I can get back to promoting my old workplace. In Brussels, the eStratCom Task Force is a team that runs EU versus Disinfo websites and awareness-raising campaign that analyzes, exposes, explains Russia's strategies and debunks the messages of disinformation. And I think that is a great platform to start with learning what is disinformation and what are the latest trends there. And there is also a newsletter that you can subscribe to. And now I can maybe stop this advertising effort. Well, and then as I come from Finland, I think that the Nordic countries have some good practices in countering disinformation, especially when it comes to the overall building the trust and resilience in the societies, like reducing inequality, like doing all sorts of preventative measures that then carry on in the future to reduce the effects of disinformation. So that would be probably my top 3 list.
Sounds great to me, and I think we could do a lot worse than copying Lithuanian and Finnish government. But James, you worked with governments in Europe extensively yourself. So what are the best practices that you've seen in Europe?
So I think it's a bit difficult to say, you see a best practice and then you can copy it and do it somewhere else. Like often the best practices are very country specific. So the things that Lithuania is really good at probably wouldn't work here. And that's sort of one of the problems is figuring out what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses, and can anything be applied anywhere else? I think at sort of general levels, some things can. So for example, one of the strengths that governments have in difference to civil society is that they aren't just about single issues. So governments have to place disinformation in the context of all of the other foreign policy issues that they're facing. So if they're dealing with Russia, they need to have a country strategy, for example, where they're looking at the diplomacy, they're looking at trade, commercial relations. So they aren't just focused on that one thing, because the one thing, it can lead you astray. It can, disinformation is not the entirety of our relationship with these countries. So I think, a benefit of government is that it has a sort of broader mandate, it's fitting disinformation within a broader strategy, which means there are other levers that governments can use to try and stop the disinformation, which might not just be debunking or meeting it at the communications level. It might involve, for example, sanctions or using diplomacy, saying to them, well, if you carry on doing this, we'll stop exchanges, we'll stop this trade deal. There's lots of options that you have as a government, which also include exposing and attributing. So attribution is when you name and shame whoever's spreading the disinformation. So governments are really well placed to do that because they have intelligence agencies who often have the technical data to expose a country. So they can do things like that, and they can put demands on private sector actors. So if the tech companies have data, as researchers, we ask for it, they say no, but governments can say, no, you have to give it to us by law. So that's, again, another great advantage that governments have. Something that was touched upon in the last panel, I think is a really interesting, fairly new thing, is pre-bunking or inoculation. So you're all familiar with debunking. It's where you kind of fact check, you show that something is false. Pre-bunking is where you go out before it happens and try and prepare the public for the falsehood that hasn't yet come. So in the week before the Ukraine war, the US government was going out and trying to pre-bunk the reasons Russia would be giving for going to war with with Ukraine. And this was quite a new thing because, so in health misinformation studies, there's lots of pre-bunking where you go out, for example, there'll be disinformation around vaccines. So you go out and you try and tell people beforehand and try and inoculate them against the disinformation. What the Americans did that was different was use intelligence information to kind of go out and say, well, it's highly likely that this will happen. It's highly likely that there will be a provocation in this border area involving, a car with dead bodies in it. We can say with high confidence. And that's different to the health misinformation stuff where it's fact. This isn't fact, it's an intelligence judgment. And I think that's a really interesting thing that probably only governments can do right now. And then lastly, the area that I'm most involved in is government communications. Because in certain areas, governments are the only legitimate actors who can really go out and speak and take responsibility for things like public health and public safety. So if you can train up the government communication side to be credible, to be trustworthy, and to act decisively when real-world harms are affecting the public, I think that's a tremendous asset that only really governments can do. Obviously, COVID is one example of where that could have worked better, where perhaps they learned a lot and there's still a lot more to learn. But it's definitely one of the areas where governments are extremely well placed.
And Josef Schlerka was talking exactly about that during the earlier panel. I will bring in the Ukrainian angle, as I promised in the opening remarks. It seems to me that ever since 2014, which is probably the beginning of this renewed information aggression coming from Russia. It was in 2014 when General Breedlove from NATO said that what we have seen was the most amazing information warfare blitzkrieg we have ever seen in the history. It seems to me that Ukraine, and perhaps other countries in Eastern Europe, are leading in fighting disinformation. When we were building EU versus Disinfo in 2015, the model, the inspiration, was the Ukrainian project StopFake, exposing disinformation systematically. I believe it was in 2015 when Ukraine banned some of the Russian channels. They faced some backlash in Western Europe. 7 years later, we see that Western Europe is doing exactly that as well. And perhaps we should have listened to the Ukrainians. And many of the civil society initiatives are built on a Ukrainian blueprint or Eastern European, like the Czech Elves, who were built based on the Baltic states. So is it possible to say that when it comes to fighting disinformation, it's these countries, the East, Ukraine and the Baltic states, that have the more practice than the West, and that it's countries like this that are showing us how to do it?
Well, I would say that definitely when it comes to resisting and responding to Russia's disinformation campaigns, or to state-backed, organized, well-designed, well-resourced disinformation, active measures type of campaigns that originate in long history and experience that Russia's state organizations have in this. I think that definitely the East and Eastern countries are, first of all, have been much more targeted by these actions, and second of all, have much earlier realized that this nothing fundamentally have changed, that these type of attacks are continuing. This, like Russia's behavior in this, didn't change as maybe many thought and expected in the 90s and after the collapse of Soviet Union. So that experience is definitely in there. And I think that now, just looking back to the times when I started working on disinformation, I think that many of the like the voices that we have heard today, even would, like the talk about Russia's information warfare and how to counter it, was sometimes considered in the West and Western audiences as completely inadequate. It was considered as someone just calling, the wolf all the time, and it wasn't taken seriously. So now, when the worst has happened, and when there is like a huge tragedy and catastrophe that we are facing in Ukraine, I think that a lot of that when we look back to history, proves that many of the lessons that were there in the East, also on disinformation campaigns, have proven to be true at this moment. So that's yes, please, James.
Well, look, I'm an academic, so I'm not going to say, I can't say yes or no. I can just say, well, maybe a bit both ways, but it's very complicated. Definitely, I completely agree. So countries with close proximity to the Russian border have been much more aware of the threat and much more, they know that Russia is a neighbor, not just for, you normally say a dog is for life, not just for Christmas, right? Russia is also for life. It's not just for Christmas. It's always there. It's always going to be there. And so if you're a bordering country, of course, you know the nature of the threat. Maybe for 10 years the threat disappears, but you know it's going to cycle back around. And I think countries in the East have been much more open and honest about that. They've been telling the West for years, no, look, you can't take Putin at his word. You can't start to think there'll be a peace dividend after the end of the Cold War. And, so that means that, in one sense, the East has been much more prepared. It never really let down its guard. But every country is different, and there's no single way of combating disinformation or dealing with it. Different countries are allowed to do different things. So in the Baltics, you can monitor the public debate that's happening among the Russian diaspora, for example, in ways that you'd never be able to do in Western Europe. You can't apply that model. So there's no simple way, but then other countries have their relative benefits. Ukraine is great for civil society. It has a fantastic civil society that's built up and is extremely effective. Sweden, maybe Finland, have very good trust in journalism, which is a different kind of asset for combating disinformation. The UK has really strong government communications, which is a different, very bad politicians, very bad messages to spread through government communications, but the actual infrastructure is very sound and very, very capable. So I would rather say, I think, trying to get off the fence now, in conclusion, that actually we've been very interconnected. We've all been learning from each other. I think there's a lot that came from Eastern European countries, their wisdom, their knowledge, particularly their warnings. But then there's also a lot of know-how in the West around communications in particular that I think has come back into the East. So it's interconnected, it's complicated, it's messy, and we're still kind of in the process of learning from each other and figuring out which parts apply where.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's really crucial to highlight the differences between the audiences. And it is true that many of the measures that we can see are working for a particular audience in Ukraine maybe wouldn't work as well in Germany. When we have a look at the various countermeasures, like, a bird view, it seems to me that we can kind of group them into several bigger groups. You both already know my model of 4 lines of defense, that we can kind of document what is happening, we can raise awareness about what's happening, we can try and repair the information weaknesses, and we can try and limit, punish, deter the information aggressors. And many of the measures we talked about would fit into one or more of these groups. But I would like to discuss the 4th one a bit, because that was also always the most controversial, be it in Brussels or in other Western European countries. The EU itself, in its official documents, they are talking about the need to impose costs on those who are spreading disinformation. What tools do we have here? Because most of what we see so far was putting them on the sanctions list. But some of the documents were talking about, definancing or definancing disinformation. And I don't think we have actually seen a lot there. So what are the options for us to actually impose the costs on the aggressors to make it harder for them?
It's really, really difficult, I think. Information is cheap, right? It's very easy to produce. So anyone can go on Twitter, create a fake account, and start spreading disinformation. It's not illegal to lie. It's not illegal to be an asshole. Thank goodness, because we all need to be an arsehole from time to time. It is, in some places, illegal to use hate speech. It's illegal to cause harm deliberately. It's illegal to hack. It's illegal to do, some of the things around disinformation. So I've often felt that kind of going for disinformation directly probably won't work. And in fact, what we should look to do is other areas around it, particularly hate speech and cyber, is build in kind of disinformation sanctions onto those, because you're much more likely to be able to get some kind of legal response around hate speech or a cyber attack. But often they include a disinformation dimension. So the hate speech may involve disinformation. Cyber attacks often have, let's say it's a phishing attack, right? It's an email that makes you click on a link. So there's a disinformation component to how that hack took place. And if you can start to bring disinformation sanctions into those areas, that's a way of us getting disinformation on the table as a way of doing sanctions. In the end, obviously, Russia made it really easy for us. They invaded Ukraine, which meant that the disinformation sanctions, so the sanctions around state media in this case, could just piggyback onto all of the other sanctions and travel bans and the various things that they did. But I always felt that was the best way to get real kind of punishment for disinformation, actually try and piggyback on some other area where there is established sanctions regimes. But that low cost of entry, the fact that anyone can produce disinformation, that it's easy, it's cheap, how do we raise the costs of that? And part of it, I think, has to come from the tech platforms, so the venues where the disinformation is being spread. So if you go to a restaurant in America, they will say, no shirt, no shoes, no service, right? That's not the law. That's not the US law. There's nothing in US law that says if you're not wearing a shirt, you can't buy a hamburger. But the restaurants themselves decide if you're on their territory, you have to put a shirt on. And it's the same on social media. They are saying if you're on social media, you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that. So one of the things that I think we really need to put a lot of effort into, but hasn't really been going that well, is getting the social media platforms to have better terms of service, where their rules are essentially, if you're on our platform, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do that. It's not legal, it's just their rules when you're on their territory. But then even more importantly, to get them to enforce it, because their terms of service now, they don't enforce consistently. So that's one of the huge kind of issues. So that's a way of raising the costs again, making it harder to spread disinformation, making it more costly. You have to spend more money to produce it, basically. And then lastly, our kind of, we call them actor-specific strategies. So the Russia strategy, the China strategy, the Iran strategy, the terrorist group strategies that governments produce, that intelligence agencies work on, disinformation has to be a part of that and kind of factored into it. The problem is that a lot of these organizations have been built to deal with different kinds of issues, much more high priority issues. So issues that lead to death, issues that can lead to explosions in cities. And that's where all of their efforts are focused. Obviously, disinformation is way down that priority list. It's a very low priority. But the problem is, as we all know, disinformation can erode trust in government. It can erode trust in each other. It can cause, very slowly, over long periods of time, massive social problems that actually can be as significant as an immediate threat. It's just that they are kind of, sometimes call it death by 1,000 cuts. It's like this very slow process of eroding democracy, essentially. So I think we need to kind of raise the profile of disinformation in that sense, get it seen as more of a priority, but also understand at what point does it become a priority? At what point do we need to take it seriously? And how do we kind of reconfigure the way we think about these issues to make sure that the fact that it's kind of low level, the fact that it seems a bit silly, bots on Twitter, how do we make sure that that's treated seriously when it has the conditions to create a more significant, a more serious situation?
I believe this death by 1,000 cuts is a metaphor used by the Chinese. Russians have this drop of water falling on a stone that makes the whole via being persistent and not via strength. Yeah, Annelie, your answer, maybe take into account also what James said, that disinformation should be made part of the Russia strategy. And you recall the years in Brussels where everybody was like, let's have this actor-agnostic approach. Let's not single out actors like Russia and China.
Yes, I have spent years with struggling with that kind of approach, and I think it required Russia's invasion of Ukraine before that changed in Brussels and EU level, in the thinking and in the policy. So that's probably referring to the point when do we think that disinformation threat is big enough to take action? Like now, when the war started, or the invasion, mass land invasion of Ukraine happened, only then the time came for the EU to sanction Russian outlets and propaganda channels and the leading propaganda voices. So was that too late? Was that the right time when it could happen? It's a question. But maybe just to add some other maybe just individual examples of what could be done more. I think that when we talk about imposing the cost on disinformation actors, and then through these other fields like cyber, that's definitely something that should be happening. But it's also, again, very slow process, and we have seen that the EU cyber strategy and cyber sanctions, like as a toolbox, was created within more than 10 years. It took more than 10 years to have that in place. So only now it's even possible for the EU to sanction some cyber actors, and they have done that for some Russian actors as well. But not to all that are out there. But then these individual examples, so I think it would be, every country would need to constantly develop also their legislation and regulation so that it would be corresponding to this digital age and time, and that's clearly not the case in many of the countries. And then the one way of dealing with the domestic proxies and domestic disinformation actors would be then to use these legal ways against them. As I think there were some people already in the previous panel, but let me just refer again to one example from Finland where a well-known pro-Russia propagandist was convicted for harassing a journalist. And he's the actor who is organizing Russia's disinformation campaigns targeting Finland. So I think that these existing legislation, just to use that, would be one way of dealing with the problem.
Sounds great. Recently Edmond published this report, and Claire Werdel, when she was promoting it on Twitter, she actually highlighted that the problem had been underestimated for years, that we simply should have done more, that we haven't done enough so far. So this is a kind of two-in-one question. Do you see it similarly? Have we really, both the governments and the civil society and the media and the social media platforms, have we underestimated the problem? Should we have done more? And what more should we have done?
Yes, we've underestimated the problem. And the last 5 years going around talking about this, you spend 90% of the time talking about the problem and trying to persuade people that there is a problem, and then the last 10% talking about solutions. It's extremely frustrating because every time, every meeting you have, every workshop, every conference, it's all talking about the problem. And then there will always, if you don't do it, there will always be someone who says, yeah, but are they really that bad? Or it doesn't really happen here, not in Sweden, not in France, we don't really have it here. And it's very, very frustrating. So, yes, we've underestimated the problem. What more should we do? Well, we need to start generating more ideas, get more people involved in finding solutions. So, it's great that you're all here and you're here to the bitter end of today's disinformation series of panels. But it's no good if it just comes from a small group of experts or the people who sit with this all day. It has to come from people who have a fresh perspective, who are the targets of the disinformation, who are the ones who tell their friends, no, don't click on those links, they're rubbish, we know that. So I think we need more engagement with the public, more ideas, more exchanges of ideas. That may mean we have to spend a bit of time with you talking about the problem again, but also, talking a bit about the solutions that we have and then hearing your perspectives on the solutions.
Well, yes, I also agree that we underestimated the problem, and there was a lot of frustrating work in trying to convince the political leaders in the seriousness of the threat. But maybe so I think on the positive side, there really has been a growth in different actors, NGOs, media, journalists, researchers, governments working on the topic. It has become much more mainstream than it was back then when Jakub started, and then I joined the Brussels group. So it's there really has been a positive change there. There is more money. There are more people now working on the topic. The question is, are there really results that have been achieved? Is this really working? All the solutions that we are proposing, is this leading to a better direction, or do we actually see that disinformation is becoming a bigger threat and only growing? I think, unfortunately, that wherever I go and wherever I talk to people, it seems that these polarization, divisions in the societies, disinformation is only growing. So then what can we do in the end? I think that there's yes, new ideas would be great to have some people who would have just anything, But otherwise, then we continue on the same lines that have been there from the beginning, which is improved communication, debunking, pre-bunking, sanctions, restrictive measures to those who are behind this, social media regulation, and all of this has to be developed. And maybe it's like a matter of time. Maybe time is what we are actually fighting against here, so that we would be up to date in our response compared to the threat, as everything is so painfully slow.
Great. We will open it for your questions in just a few minutes. Let me just have one final question before I turn to the audience. What both of you actually talked about resonates with something I was talking about just recently. I was invited to a workshop. They wanted me to evaluate the response of the Ukrainian civil society to disinformation. What makes them so good? And it's kind of hard to come up with one quality, right? But then it kind of struck me that the key thing is the numbers. When we had the Ukrainian election task force, we had meetings with the government agencies, with the political parties, and then we had a meeting with Ukrainian civil society. We went there straight from the airport, from DC. We were delayed for 2 or 3 hours. They were still waiting there. There was 40, 50 people around the table, each of them representing a different NGO, each of them representing a different civil society organization, working on disinformation. You don't have these numbers anywhere else in Europe. And it kind of reminded me what Richard Stengel was writing in the book Information Wars. Richard Stengel was basically doing our job in the US State Department, although he was probably a bit better funded. But he came to the conclusion that both the Russians and ISIS are defeating us in the information space because of the numbers. not because their message would be better, not because their message would be more attractive, not because they would have some more sophisticated methods how to deliver it, not because they would have better communication, but it's purely the numbers. Would you agree with this estimate? Or I presume James will say that it's a bit more complicated. But who wants to start?
I can start before James says no, I can't agree with this. Well, I can talk about what I have seen now on during Russia's invasion of Ukraine on Telegram, especially. I think, and in Russia's propaganda in general. So I have been following especially Russian state TV and then these Telegram channels. And I think that what we could see on the state TV, yes, they did prepare the audience, the Russian population, for the invasion. There was increased messaging on dehumanizing Ukrainians, for example, at least since January. But still, the actual invasion did come as a surprise. And there was this period of time on the TV where they were confused, but it wasn't clear whether the messaging wasn't really there yet. And then they got their package together again and started talking more and more about by April, May, it was much more not about Ukraine anymore at all, but Russia is fighting this holy war against NATO and US and the collective West with the aim to change the world order. So on the other hand, on Telegram, I think that there was this similar frustration being seen. I think that many of these Russian propaganda channels, disinformation channels on Telegram, there was this atmosphere of frustration and desperation there almost, where they felt that they are trying to fight Ukrainians who are everywhere and they are desperately losing. And of course, this is only the selection of messaging and channels that I have seen. So I can't make a scientific conclusion out of this sample, but yes. But still, then I think that there was a change where I just felt that oh my God, these numbers that Russia has behind their disinformation campaigns is just endless. It's like every day there was a new initiative, a new website appeared, where again there was a list of Ukrainians' personal details published to prepare personal attacks against them. And these were like big projects that require months of work to be able to do that. Hackers behind them, and then like these comms, disinformers, building up the websites and the content side of it. So I think at least that's my current take on Russia's propaganda, that it really felt that there was just more and more coming after this initial very short confusion period when the invasion started.
Yeah, I agree that numbers are really important. I'm not going to disagree with that. So one of the reasons numbers are so important is because volume matters on social media, right? If you're trying to get something to trend, if you want the algorithms to pick it up and spread it to more people, then if it seems like it's more interesting to lots of people, then it will get picked up and amplified. So amplification, you need numbers to get that started if you're kind of manipulating the amplification. So that's really important. And the second side of it is that a lot of the stuff that Annalie was describing involves what we call cross-platform coordination. And what that means is you start off somewhere, let's say on a Telegram channel, and you say, look at this story, or look at this account, or look at something that's happening on Twitter or on Facebook. Let's all go there and start trolling this person. Let's all go there and start attacking them, criticizing them. And they'll move over in their tens or their hundreds or their thousands all at once and start attacking this person or a hashtag or issue, whatever it is. So the numbers really do matter. And what we've seen, what you've seen in your work, Annelies, especially, a lot of the numbers are quite low in the end of what Russia is able to bring to some of these efforts to kind of influence things. Possibly because the Russians kind of shot themselves in the foot, because they obviously banned a lot of the Western platforms in Russia, or throttled them and kind of lowered access to them, which means there are actually fewer Russians who can get onto the Western platforms and start trolling or start kind of getting the Russian message out there. So they may have made some tactical errors that took them a while then to kind of get the hang of and figure out ways to get around it. But I think what that also brings us around to is quite interesting. So numbers, yes, very important, but I think it's also important for us to start thinking less about the content, which is sort of, it can be very problematic, but more about the techniques. Because in disinformation, it's not just kind of what someone puts in a message that's false, it's how they do it. And the fact that it's an adversary who is clever and who adapts. So whatever measures you put in place, if you build a wall this high, they'll figure out how to jump over it. If you build a wall this high, they'll come with ladders and figure a way to jump over it. So disinformation is always about finding the gap, finding the new maneuver, the new way of getting around whatever's being decided. So, I think we need, in addition to the numbers that are very important, we need to get away from this idea that disinformation is just about fake news or false messages, but it's actually about adversarial strategies for getting around any kind of rules, any kind of norms, any kind of laws that you set up. It's a game of cat and mouse, and that's what Russia understands, and perhaps we don't when we're planning our countermeasures.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So I think now is a good time to take some questions from the audience, so I hope you will have many. We've had questions on the countermeasures ever since the morning, but...
So first of all, I would like to thank you for all the presentation and discussions we have here. I think it's have quite a big impact on all of us. But to get to the question, I would like to ask you, like you are from Sweden and Great Britain, how the general public or the people in these countries is looking what the, for example, Czech government or even general public in Central Eastern Europe, or maybe specifically in Czech Republic, is doing to improve the, for example, the protect from disinformations. When you look, for example, specifically on the war on Ukraine, and what we can improve from your point of view, what we can do better, like the general public and the government.
Well, maybe I start. Maybe I can speak about Finland, because I'm actually from Finland. I just live in Sweden right now, but I have recently moved, so I don't feel like talking for Sweden yet. But when it comes to Finland, there is a package of measures that the government and the civil society have been doing since 2014. Some of Russia's disinformation campaigns, major ones, started targeting Finland already in 2009. So that's when the government, that was the wake-up call for Finland and for lots of the media as well. And there was quite a learning curve, I think, for everyone how to deal with this. And I was back then working as a journalist myself, and I can say that not everything was perfect. How I covered those campaigns, it was quite new and difficult topic at that time, and difficult to find ways to not to repeat the false message and instead expose the campaign behind it. But now I think after all these years, so the Finnish government response is consisting of several different ways how to tackle it. There is a Stratcom unit in the Prime Minister's office, which was strengthened now during COVID-19, which also trains and educates people on disinformation and do strategic communication, so long-term campaigns on on strategic issues. There is the hybrid COE that, that Jakub is working in, a joint EU-NATO initiative, an NGO that tackles hybrid threats. There is a coordination group between the ministries. I think this is where Finnish approach is very good for a small country. The coordination is very flexible. All the spokes of different ministries meet regularly to discuss potential disinformation threats. And then there is the long-term investment in education and media literacy, which I think is probably the best example of what Finland is doing, where the kids really from kindergarten start learning how to have a critical mindset in the information that you receive. Then since the war, I think what Finland has, like what are the additional efforts that have gone to tackle disinformation? In Finland, the armed forces were traditionally quite quite moderate in their communication, so they weren't very open. The Finnish model sort of has been not to communicate about military things, which, like, not to give any too easy advantage to the enemy behind the border. But that changed quite dramatically after the invasion. So the armed forces has been very actively commenting and explaining what is happening in Ukraine. So I think that was like a quite clear improvement on that scene.
So maybe I can answer the part of your question that was about how we view the Czech Republic. I think like Czech Republic has a really strong reputation in this. There's, obviously they were there since the beginning as far as when disinformation started to be recognized as a problem. The two Jakubs, so Kelensky and Janda, very vocal, very international, able to get people moving, able to convene, and get international people to take it seriously. So I think, that part of it has been very much driving the agenda internationally for some years. Obviously, this Jakub was involved in setting up EU versus Disinfo, which again has turned into one of the sort of fundamental international institutions. So there you have Czech influence directly and now indirectly as it continues and evolves sort of in its own way. It may not be the thing you envisaged in the very beginning, but it's still there and it's still growing and developing. Then obviously Vera Jourova is in she's vice president of the EU Commission, and disinformation has been a huge part of her work on the Democracy Action Plan. I was fortunate enough to be advising her work on that. Takes it very seriously, very clear on the issues, very bold in explaining them, doesn't hold back. There's no need to be too diplomatic, I think, sometimes when we're talking about this stuff. And you have, Semantic Visions here, which has been leading in the analysis of disinformation for years. What else? And some of the work I've done for government communications has been translated into Czech. It's been trained with the government here. So I think, really solid reputation, really solid partner for the countries who have been taking this seriously for years. And kind of punching above your weight, I would say, in this area.
Thank you very much for the kind words. I can also add that when the Center for Countering Terrorism and Hybrid Threats was established in the Ministry of Interior, I was in the Brussels unit. We were approached by many EU nations trying to find out what are they working on. It was one of the first centers set up on the national level. So I think, at least for a certain time, Czechs were perceived as one of the leading nations when it comes to countering disinformation, I believe. So do we have any further questions? Here in the second row.
I wonder whether we are able, because all that you're talking about will take enormous time. And you're talking about educating the society, about improving our educational system and all that. And we've seen in this country, in particular in Czechia, that it is a very long-term process. And we also see that while perhaps in many respects we've learned a lot more since the change of the regime, in other respects there's been a kind of a drop of the intellectual level of the society, because now people have access to all kinds of amusement, distractions like the tabloids and all, and they give preference to these, and they give preference to whatever is easy for them to understand and whatever comforts their own conviction. And if I say so, I'm a kind of a devil's advocate, because myself, I wouldn't like the democracy to change. But don't you think that the fact that Putin and the likes weaponizes information, and we all know that weapons is not something that should be carried by everyone, because they can't be handled properly by everyone, and there are weapons and weapons. There are toxic weapons, there are chemical weapons which have been banned by international treaties, but I think that disinformation is something like chemical weapons, because nobody knows from where it comes, and it poisons a large area. And some only get sick, some die, and we don't know how to defend ourselves. So don't you think that, I know that whenever somebody starts speaking about curtailing the freedom of expression, there are outcries like banning some of the disinformation webs. There are outcries like we shouldn't touch on the freedom of expression. But I think that we are disarming ourselves in front of what's going on in countries like Russia against these threats. I think they don't aspire to convince everyone by disinformation, because they know that they won't. But it's enough for them to devise people, to cast doubt in the souls that are not very keen on reading facts and finding information. So what to do about that in the future?
I think you've hit the nail on the head as far as the nature of the problem. I mean, democracy is designed for us to debate, and it's supposed to be the strongest ideas that win. So you say yes, I say no, let's have a cup of coffee or a beer and we'll talk it over and decide which idea is best. But obviously that kind of system hasn't been working very well for a few years. It's very polarized political debate. It's not really suited to social media. You don't really know who you're debating with. You can hide behind false identities. A lot of the things we take for granted in democracy aren't working quite as well as they should be. Add into that the fact that propaganda is not legitimate communication, right? It's not that kind of discussion where you say yes, I say no, and let's talk it out. Propaganda is meant to benefit the person who's spreading it. It's a means of, as you say, it's almost a weapon. Perhaps as a metaphor, it's a weapon. Which means that we can't just allow that to pollute our space for deliberation and discussion. We have to figure out ways of coping with it. And that's where we're really struggling. perhaps, instead of focusing too much on the disinformation side, we need to start thinking again about democracy, what it is in a digital age, what it is in a social media age, and really try and breathe some new life into it. Try and get a bit of inspiration around what society is supposed to be like. But that needs some better leadership than we've had. There's definitely a lack of political talent in many countries. But also ideas, some idea generation around what is political deliberation in an age of social media, in an age of weaponized communication. So if anyone has any ideas, feel free to. We have 15 minutes left. Let's try and fix this.
Well, that's good. Very good to have a global debate on the future of democracy in 15 minutes. But maybe still on, like, more just concretely on shutting down disinformation channels. I think in a way we are now experiencing very interesting time because of EU sanctions against Russia's propaganda channels, which means that these RT and other Russian channels are not accessible anymore from the European Union or from Europe. So we can see now what happens in this situation. How much less do we consume Russian propaganda? How much less do we see it and see it spreading? We do see, of course, not all of the channels have now been banned, and it's still easy to get those messages, and Russia is all the time trying to get through those bans and circumvent them. But I think it has had an effect. No, it's not. It's also not a perfect solution. It hasn't stopped the disinformation completely from spreading and us from consuming it. So it's also, I think that it really doesn't give the final, the full answer to this. Just thinking about like shutting down disinformation channels. So it has to be this wider combination of different measures.
So do we have any further questions anywhere? So I might, yeah.
Okay. Hi. Just a while ago, just like 30 minutes ago, I was talking with my family about like Ukraine and Russia. And I was saying to my cousin that the thinking of the people in Russia is different based on the information they get. And she said, how can I be sure that the information I get is objective? Because, like, I'm sorry, I came late, so I don't know if you were talking about this before. But how can anyone say, like, their perspective is objective? Because in general, nothing is objective. So how can you prove your point to someone who says, how do you know that your information is more valid than mine? Because I took it from those webs that you say is disinformative. But how do you know your true is the true way? So how do I defend myself?
Well, I think that's a brilliant question. That's a brilliant argument that the disinformers also very often use, and where a lot of this Russian domestic manipulation of their domestic audiences is based exactly on this. It's always, but what is, okay, so we have propaganda, but what is BBC doing? Everything is relative. Everything you never will know the final truth. So it's a brilliant argument. I'm not sure if I have really a good answer to it. But what to, like, I think it's always good to when you talk to a person who believes in disinformation, it's always good to be very constructive and not go through aggressive stages of argumentation, and instead try to refer to some personal experience. So I think that's sort of one way to go about convincing a person who believes in disinformation. But maybe then on objective reality, would you like to follow up?
So I think there are two things. Like, one is that you don't consume news in a vacuum. Like, if there's a newspaper that you read it every day and you're reading lots of stories, which means there's a track record there, right? Over the last 10 years, the last 5 years, you've been reading it. Otherwise, either the image of reality that they're giving you matches, or they're leading you astray. And you can build up that over time based on the stories that you're reading. So having trusted sources that you know generally give you good accuracy, that genuinely match your idea of what reality is, that's a good start. Even better then is if you can find more sources and triangulate, right? Maybe you want an American news source and a German news source as well to get some different perspectives and start to get your ideas. What I love to do, which is perhaps not for everyone, but I also love to read the other side's perspectives as well. And that helps me triangulate. So if I know, like in Britain, if I know what the Daily Mail is saying, then I know the kind of most hate-filled, extreme, out there perspectives on it. That helps me triangulate and kind of get my idea of what's true and what isn't, based on the fact that I know most of it is an exaggeration. But triangulating, building trust with the news sources. There's no objective reality, perhaps. That's for the philosophy discussion tomorrow. But we can build trust. We can at least try and confirm our own views and find individual journalists we trust, news sources we trust, and then build an image of what we think is correct.
Maybe actually just a brief answer, if I may abuse the moderator role. I think part of the answer is definitely democracy versus dictatorship, pluralism versus autocracy. You would never build such a disinformation machine that Vladimir Putin has built in a democracy. Both Annelie and I used to work as a journalist. We were eager to find out stories that the government is lying to us. We were really the guardian dogs trying to find out when the government is lying. You would try to do that in Russia, and in the better case, you would end in exile. In the worst case, in Siberia, or just like Boris Nemtsov, killed near the Kremlin. So there's a very big difference between a democracy where you have a system of checks and balances and a country that is precisely eliminating these checks and balances. This is why it's so important to protect your own institutions, to protect your ministries, but also your media and your NGOs, because it's the plurality of these voices that will bring you closer to the objective reality rather than the autocratic voice decided by one crazy man in the Kremlin. We have 6 minutes left, so do we have any last question for our panelists? So let me have one last, if there's no one. Is there one? Great. We can't hear the microphone.
Would you believe that it goes towards? Does it improve slightly, or does it grow worse in the long run, from your point of view?
Now you mean what precisely? Like the whole problem with disinformation?
Yes. And whatever it triggers.
Well, this will not be a hopeful end note, though, because I unfortunately do think that the problem is growing. It's more mainstream. There are more layers in overall in societies that that do fall for disinformation. It's if it was something that was where Russia pioneered as a state that is conducting complex disinformation campaigns, now it's really like something that any actor can copy. And this is growing the problem, not diminishing it. And I think that especially what is especially hopeless or not hopeful at all is to see how disinformation has made it possible for Putin's regime to invade Ukraine and make the Russian population support this war. You might want to question some of the surveys that have been or are being conducted on Russian people's attitudes towards the war, but it's still very clear that there is a majority support for basically a genocide in Ukraine. And I think that is definitely making the problem worse, and how it could be one day, which is not now even topical, because now we need to concentrate on and focus on supporting Ukraine. But how it would even be possible to solve that, like given that Russia would be defeated and there would be a chance for Russian people to think what kind of nation, what kind of country, what kind of people they want to be, and what it would require to change the whole worldview and acknowledge that like their past and their like lots of their knowledge is based on simple manipulation and disinformation. I think it's quite devastating, and unfortunately that's my final conclusion now.
I completely agree with everything Anneli said. It's getting worse. There's very few kind of very few sort of hopeful things to take away. What I'll add is we talked a lot about Russia today, but you know, with China, again, going back to that question is, do the numbers matter? Well, the number of people that China has at its disposal to run disinformation campaigns, if they decided to do it in a really, you know, targeted way against the West, we are nowhere near able to deal with that. Now, at the moment, like China is really good at collecting in data and learning all about us and about everyone in the world. They're very good at kind of vacuuming in the data. They're not so good at creating influence campaigns that would work, say, in the Czech Republic. But they'll learn that. And it might take 5 years, it might take 10 years, but it's coming, it's inevitable. And yeah, we need to start preparing for that, not just what's on our kind of immediate doorstep, but start thinking 10, 20, 30 years ahead. Because this isn't disappearing. If anything, the potential for manipulation is just getting worse.
This is actually something we were talking about during one of the earlier panels. For those of you who weren't there, the conclusion probably was that Russians definitely have a better know-how and knowledge and more experience. They've done disinformation for decades. The Chinese are kind of clumsy. They are not really persuasive yet, but they definitely have the resources. And what we seem to see in the information space is kind of convergence or even merging of the Chinese and Russian resources. There are exchange programs between the Russian and Chinese state pseudo-media. There are agreements signed by the highest political elite. And Chinese are increasingly copying the Russian approach, even to the extent that some researchers are talking about the Russification or Russianization of Chinese information operations. So I would fully agree that if we face the problem of like Russian know-how and Russian experience merged with the endless Chinese resources and increasingly better knowledge in the automated intelligence department, which will be increasingly more important, this problem is more likely to grow rather than otherwise. So as I've written in quite a few texts, we really need to dramatically change the mindset if we don't want to be on the losing end. So on this optimistic note, let me thank Anneli and James for coming over. Thank you very much. We really appreciate you finding your way to Ostrava. Thank you. Thank you.